Welcome back, friends, for part 5 of our discussion of World War II. Last time we were together, we were discussing the U.S.'s entrance into World War II officially. Now, let's take a step back. After World War I, Japan sought to expand its colonial power in Asia. As the military got control over the government, Japan began a program of expansionism. First in Manchuria and China in 1931, then invading mainland, more so of China in 1937. Japan really prosecuted a brutal war against the Chinese, earning a lot of condemnation from the United States and the European powers. In an effort to stop the fighting, the US and Britain imposed iron and oil embargoes, trying to cut those off from Japan. Needing these materials to continue the war, Japan sought to acquire them through conquest, continuing to conquer new areas. To eliminate the threat posed by the United States, Japan is going to strike against the U.S. fleet at Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941, as well as other colonies in the region of the British. That is when the U.S. makes its entrance into World War II. Now, some people will say that the United States had some forewarning of this attack, but it was not enough for them to be truly prepared. Now, Japan attacks the U.S. on that day, December 7th, 1941, on a Sunday morning, with its planes coming in. That's a long journey for the Japanese to come across the Pacific and to completely surprise the U.S. But this was a brutal strike. The Japanese thought the U.S. would join the war eventually and decided to make that first strike instead, an attack to try to cripple the Navy of the United States at Pearl Harbor. Now, 353 Japanese bombers were launched from 6 of their aircraft carriers at dawn and began to bomb ships, planes, and other sites throughout that area in Pearl Harbor. 4 battleships, 3 cruisers, 3 destroyers, those are smaller ships. The battleships, obviously, are the largest, were destroyed. 188 planes were destroyed, 2,402 men killed, and 1,282 wounded. This is a disastrous day for the American Navy. The only positive is that the American aircraft carriers, which were really the best and most important ships in this era of war, had not been in the harbor at this time. They had been out in the open ocean and had been saved from this attack. But many of the most important ships of the American Navy are destroyed that day in Pearl Harbor, sitting just docked in the bay when they are attacked by the Japanese. How do you think the Americans are going to react to this? So a little bit more specifics on December 7th, 1941. 7:55 a.m. on that Sunday, a lot of these men are relaxing. It's a weekend day. They're drying their laundry, sitting out, enjoying the beautiful Hawaiian weather, and hundreds of Japanese warplanes coming from those aircraft carriers come over the hills and start bombing them. They're completely surprised. And Pearl Harbor's got a pretty shallow depth, but the Japanese had this all planned out, and they even designed their torpedoes to be especially successful in that shallow water. 8 battleships, including the famous USS Arizona, is sunk. 3 light cruisers, 3 destroyers. As I mentioned, 4 other vessels are either sunk or very severely damaged. On that day, President Roosevelt would call this a date which will live in infamy when he gives his speech the next day. The Japanese also hit American forces in Guam, on Wake Island in the Philippines, British forces in Malaya and Hong Kong. Now, typically, if we're in the classroom, I would be able to show you more videos and things of that nature. I might attach them to your assignment as well to be able to see these things. I think it's important to see Pearl Harbor. We are lucky enough to have some footage of Pearl Harbor, as well as certainly pictures of the damage done on this attack by the Japanese on Pearl Harbor. As you can see some of the pictures here, that blast of the USS Arizona, this is the wreckage down below of the USS Arizona before it sinks. And indeed, as those newspapers say, war. The Japanese have attacked. This is going to force the US to commit to war. And immediately you will see propaganda like this coming out throughout the United States. Avenge Pearl Harbor. So on December 8th, the next day, on that Monday, the U.S. declares war on the Japanese Empire. Now, not long after, just several days later, the allies of the Japanese, of course, Germany and Italy, declare war on the United States on December 11th. So Hitler and Mussolini joined Japan in war upon America, as that newspaper article shows on the upper right. Now, not long after, in January of 1942, just that next month, in the early days of that month, ships are leaving the eastern coast of the United States. And those U-boats of the Germans, which have not attacked very many U.S. ships up to this point, they've tried to avoid that. Now, these ships with their lights on are silhouetted against the lights of the cities like Manhattan, New York, Boston, places like that. And 8 unarmed vessels are sunk by German U-boats. By the end of January, U-boats would sink 25 ships along the East Coast, continuing a fierce struggle for control of the seas. This was called the Battle of the Atlantic. And this was threatening to choke off America's supplies and the supplies flowing over to Great Britain and France. More than 230 Allied ships and almost 5 million tons of material went to the bottom of the sea in the first 6 months of 1942. The Germans were finally really exercising their declaration of war now on the United States by sinking U.S. and British ships there in the Atlantic Ocean. Now Americans were finally seeing, after Pearl Harbor and now the sinking of American ships, the war was really coming to them instead of them being observers of this war in Europe. This is now America's new war. American industry had to support the nation's allies, not just us. It had to expand its military. Britain needed large supplies of munitions, ammunition, equipment. We had been lending them tens of thousands of trucks and other vehicles and equipment, and we played an important part in mechanizing the Soviet army as well in Russia. Amphibious warfare required large numbers of landing craft that could drop troops off on beaches, support vessels. These all had to be built still. So the first U.S. troops arrived in the British Isles in January of 1942. So it was still a while before the Americans really get heavily involved with their troops. But nearly a year passed even then before they went into action against the Axis forces. Meanwhile, air power provided virtually the only means for the Allies to strike at Germany. As we saw the Battle of Britain, and the British were able to hold strong. This led to then the Royal Air Force beginning an air offensive against Germany in May of 1942 and beginning to bomb German cities and German forces. And on the 4th of July, the first American crews started to participate in air raids against the continent as they made their way to Britain and then flew raids over Germany, attacking German forces. A fitting day, the 4th of July, 1942. For many young Americans, enlisting was a practical matter of national survival. Some of them, it was patriotism, but they knew they wanted to defend their country and do their part. They wanted to play their role in this war to defend America now. All across the country, urban areas, rural communities, military recruiting offices were jammed. This is immediately following Pearl Harbor and in the months and days after. Some offices announced they would stay open 24 hours a day, 7 days a week to accept enlistments, and they were busy. Veterans of the First World War wanted to enlist, even though most of them were too old. After the war began, every man between the ages of 18 and 65 had to at least register for the draft and be eligible to perhaps serve. Before the war ends, well over 16 million men and women were enrolled in the armed forces. That's over 12% of the total population of the United States at this time. Now, the U.S. did have a standing military when Pearl Harbor was attacked, and the men were made immediately ready for war. One of those was my great uncle, who was already enlisted. That is him in the kilt in the upper right corner. He would have that picture taken in the weeks leading up to the invasion of Normandy and the D-Day operations. The man to his left is my grandfather, who enlisted following Pearl Harbor to serve in the Pacific Theater during World War II. Many of your great-grandparents or grandparents volunteered to serve in the military at this time to do their part to protect their nation. This is a great generation that did their part to protect this country and protect democracy and protect people all around the globe. And each one of us, I would think, has some connection to that and can appreciate the sacrifices and the ultimate sacrifice that some of these individuals would make. Meanwhile, in Europe, we return to how Hitler had planned to invade Great Britain, July 16, 1941. He came up with this plan called Operation Sea Lion. He was going to take his troops, move them across the English Channel after an airborne assault on Britain, and that would have to rely, though, on the Luftwaffe, the German Air Force, gaining air superiority over the United Kingdom. Now, the RAF, the Royal Air Force of Britain, was able to hold them off. Remember, the Battle of Britain held the Germans off during that battle, the two air forces going at it from July 10th until October 31st of 1940. We discussed how the Battle of Britain marked the first major defeat of Hitler's military forces, and now Britain was able to control her skies still. This was going to force Hitler to shift his attention to the east and focus now on the Soviet Union, where he wanted to gain those key natural resources. This does gain Britain a little bit of a rest. Now, they're still going to be using their air force to defend their skies, but the Nazis are not going to focus as heavily on them for the time being. They think that Britain is pretty well defeated and that they don't have to worry about them, at least for a while. Let them worry about protecting their skies. We'll shift our attention to another place, and that's what they'll do. This is going to lead to an operation that we'll talk about next time, the invasion of the Soviet Union. The funny thing is that Stalin was also planning to stab Hitler in the back relatively soon. So both Hitler and Stalin planning at the same time to stab each other in the back. It's going to be Hitler, though, that strikes first with a plan he calls Operation Barbarossa. So he'd failed to defeat Great Britain, but he thought that they were kind of on their heels. Let's not worry about them. Now focus on the Soviet Union. In Hitler's mind, only by conquering huge territory of the Soviet Union could the Germans get the living space that they needed and the resources. He wanted to get things like the wheat in a country like the Ukraine and the oil down in the southern region that was controlled by Russia in the Caucasus. And Hitler planned this Operation Barbarossa with his commanders. There was going to be 4 million Nazi troops of the Axis forces involved in this invasion over an 1,800-mile front. That's the ground that they were going to cover. That's stretching nearly half of the border of the US and Canada. That is a huge swath of ground. It's going to be the largest invasion force in the history of warfare. They're going to have 600,000 motor vehicles, tanks, trucks, half-tracks, in between 600,000 and 700,000 horses, helping them to bring their supplies as well. This is going to be an impressive invasion force that Hitler puts together to try to conquer the Soviet Union and gain their resources, and once again, continue his push for imperialism and gain territory within Europe. We'll pick up next time diving more into detail about Operation Barbarossa as Hitler tries to continue to expand. We'll see you next time.